This video was brought to you by Imprint. On Friday, French President Emmanuel Macron met with party leaders to try and decide on a new prime minister, with another round of negotiations coming early next week. And all of this comes nearly 2 months after the French legislative elections, which ended in a hung parliament. Since then, Macron has been unable to find a new prime minister that would be acceptable to the majority of MPs, largely because Macron refused to accept candidates from the New Popular Front, who won a plurality of seats. But he's also been unable to persuade the more moderate parts of the NFP to support one of his preferred candidates. This is why Gabriel Attal is still acting as caretaker prime minister. And early this week, Attal even outlined a new budget for 2025, including spending freezes across the board. The first time a caretaker prime minister has done so in the history of the Fifth Republic. So it's become increasingly clear that any candidate that might realistically be able to garner a majority with the support of both the left and the right would have to be almost apolitical, which is one of the reasons that the NFP have now proposed a civil servant and economist called Lucie Castin. While Castin is associated with the socialists and has been opposed by Macron, she's nonetheless a far less political option than the other potential NFP candidates. However, it's not just France flirting with what we might call a technocratic government, or at least a government headed up by someone without an explicit political affiliation. The Netherlands just appointed a civil servant as prime minister, and coalition negotiations look like they might be stalling in Belgium. More generally, technocrat ministers have become increasingly common in Europe over the past 2 decades or so. So in this video, we thought we'd try and do our best to figure out why, and whether we should expect this trend towards technocracy to continue. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into the why, let's take a look at the 2 examples we just mentioned, the Netherlands and Belgium. In the Netherlands, the right-wing coalition were unable to decide on a new prime minister because the more centrist members opposed Geert Wilders, whose PV party won a plurality of seats, from becoming prime minister. The 4-party coalition eventually agreed on Dick Schoof, a former spy chief and top civil servant who wasn't well known even in the Netherlands until his appointment in June, 8 months after the election. While Schoof was put forward by Wilders, in his acceptance speech he insisted that he was not affiliated to any party, and he wanted to be the prime minister of all the Dutch. Similarly, Belgium is struggling to form a new coalition after the elections on June 9th, when the Vlaams Belang party, often described as far-right, finished in 2nd place behind the right-wing New Flemish Alliance, or N-VA. While both parties are in favour of Flemish independence, the N-VA ruled out a coalition with Vlaams Belang, on the grounds that they were just too extreme. But they've so far been unable to agree a new budget with the other centrist parties, with reoccurring disagreements over how to bring down the deficit. So, if these centrist parties are unable to come to an agreement, Belgium could end up in a similar situation to what happened between 2018 and 2020, when disagreements between potential coalition partners meant that the country went without a federal government for 652 days. These aren't isolated examples either. This study, published in 2023, found that technocratic or apolitical governments have become increasingly popular in Europe since the turn of the millennium, with the fraction of technocratic ministerial appointments rising 50% between 2000 and 2020, from about 10% to nearer 15%. This might not sound like that much, but it's worth remembering that technocrats are usually appointed as either prime minister or finance minister, which are basically the biggest offices. In fact, every European region, apart from Scandinavia, has seen an increased prevalence of technocrats, with especially sharp increases in the Baltic states, Southern Europe, and Western Europe. So why are technocrats becoming more popular in European politics? Well, as we see it, there are at least 3 reasons. The first is political fragmentation. For a variety of reasons, European politics has become increasingly fragmented, with establishment parties often outflanked by radical alternatives from both the right and left. This has made forming governments more difficult, not just because there are more parties and fewer outright majorities, but also because establishment parties often refuse to form coalitions with non-establishment or more extreme parties, limiting the potential combinations. Things have been made even more difficult by the fact that recent experience suggests that more unwieldy coalitions rarely work, which has made parties less willing to agree to more experimental coalitions. In fact, look at what happened in Germany, where the three-party coalition has been deadlocked by infighting, or in Italy, where the Brothers of Italy, the one party left out of Mario Draghi's mega coalition, went on to win the 2022 election. The second is the toxic combination of weak growth and high debt. This just means that without drastic reforms, European governments don't have enough spare cash to do what voters want them to. Because no politician wants to be on the hook for disappointing voters, the job often ends up falling to technocrats, which is sort of what happened in Italy and Greece during the Eurozone crisis. A similar dynamic is now apparent in France too, where a majority of voters have voted for parties essentially promising to spend a lot more money, despite the fact that France is already running an enormous deficit, representing over 5% of GDP, and neither the international markets nor the EU would tolerate yet more borrowing. This dynamic has been exacerbated by the fact that most European countries have given up their monetary sovereignty to the European Central Bank, and a similar dynamic can also occur in other policy areas too, where international institutions, rather than international markets, limit governments' room for maneuver. When it comes to immigration policy, for instance, many voters might want a more restrictive asylum policy, but they and their governments are limited by international law like the ECHR. But the third reason is that technocratic governments are actually surprisingly popular with their electorate. As trust in politicians has fallen, voters have become increasingly keen on technocrats, who derive their legitimacy not just from their expertise, but also because voters consider them to be outside of the political fray. Polling from last year found that voters in Poland, Italy, Spain, Greece, Ireland, and perhaps most tellingly, Belgium, all preferred civil servants to politicians. So these are the reasons that technocrats are on the rise in Europe. But is this a good thing? Well, it's sort of a matter of opinion, but the rise of technocrats and their popularity with voters doesn't reflect well on Europe's politicians. And perhaps the ideal outcome here would be for better politicians who can keep their electorates more satisfied in the first place. If you want to keep learning, the very best way is through Imprint. That's the brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, effective, and interactive learning experience built for bite-sized learning. Now, you can take advantage of their expansive library of courses, book summaries, and articles to learn about psychology, philosophy, leadership, the science of happiness, productivity systems, finance, science, technology, health and wellness, history, and more. Plus, you can learn about these things quickly, with most individual lessons taking just a few minutes to complete. That doesn't mean that it's light on information either, though. Imprint is built around the science of learning, so it helps you to build habits around learning, utilizes high-quality visuals to boost understanding, as well as letting users learn at their own pace. Ultimately, Imprint is a way to feel good about your screen time and learn something new, rather than just mindlessly scrolling on social media. So stop doom scrolling and start learning. You can do that by joining the millions of users learning on Imprint by clicking the link in the description. That way you'll get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.